Okay, hello everyone, myself Piyush Kumar. So today we're just going to discuss the third test for 2022 History Optional. Now the third test was based on modern India and we'll be discussing about the questions that have been asked in the test. The way we have been doing the discussion, we'll continue that as well here. And the way we had been emphasizing basically on the conceptual part and the structure. So the same thing we'll be doing here also, that we'll just focus that how to structureize your answer and how to like deal with the basic concept of this question. The questions are primarily conceptual in this particular part. When you will face the real examination, in that case you won't find that all the questions will be this much conceptual. There are certain questions which are very factual also, and just by presenting the facts in a right order or in a very structured manner, like you can score very good. But the reason because of what I'm keeping such kind of questions in the test is very simple, that you should have this habit or the practice. If some unwanted questions are coming, or let's say some indirect questions are coming, in that case how to tackle with these questions. The moment will land up to the mock test, in that case you won't find these kind of questions. Rather there will be kind of very good combination of both certain conceptual questions, certain indirect questions, and at the same time certain simple questions also. So this is the period when you have to learn how to face the challenges which are coming in the real examination. That's what I have been trying to this through this test series, and that's how we are just going to discuss about it, right? So okay, so this is on test number 3rd on modern India. So let us start the discussion, right? Now the first question, the various ideologies in Britain played significant role in shaping the administration in India. Now this particular question is talking about the shaping of Indian administration. You all know that India got gradually colonized in the second half of 18th century, and the way 1765 they got the Diwani right, by that time there was no that much problem as such. By 1765 they had a very good plan, and the plan was this, that they won't come into any kind of direct rule, rather they'll try to deal with it like indirectly, and that's how they hired Muhammad Reza Khan as Nayab Diwan of Bengal and Raja Sitab Rai as Nayab Diwan of Bihar. And they just thought of, and Nizamat was completely left in the hand of Nawab of Bengal. So they had a very good plan that without coming into direct administration, they could earn huge amount of money. But very soon they realized that the idea that they have planned, it's very impractical, and that's why it was not working properly. And then after 1771, once they started facing the losses, or they started failing in collecting the amount what they had been expecting to collect from here, they went for some other things, like they had been asking for loans and all, and 1773 Regulating Act is coming, and that started structurizing the administration of India, and that's how this particular thing started. So basically you have to write the beginning. When it comes to the introduction, you have to write the beginning of the British administration in India. So the way the British administration is getting set up in India. So you'll just write a brief introduction, a brief introduction about the circumstances which led to the beginning of the British administration, right? Then you'll be writing that when it comes to this administration, like here there are various, in body part you will be writing about the various ideologies, like this is the question, the various ideologies which had been playing important role. So you have to write about the various ideologies. Since it's a 10-mark question, you cannot elaborate them. So mind you, the moment you feel that you do not have ample amount of words to elaborate your ideas, in that case you should always play in point format, right? So you'll be writing about all these ideologies, such as started with the Orientalism, then utilitarian, Anglicism, then you can talk about evangelicals, and then we can talk about the supporters of free trade. So you'll just write their ideologies, and then these ideologies must be supported with certain examples. I have been already asking you to write the things in point format. So you'll just define what is this Orientalist ideology, like what kind of administration it supported in 2 or 3 lines, and then I'll just give the example, such as Warren Hastings is the ideal example of this Orientalist ideology and certain decisions made by him. So that's how we'll write about the Orientalist ideology, then Anglicist ideology, then evangelical, then all these 4, 5 or 5, 6 ideologies which are there, and then you'll conclude that over the period like these policies had been playing very remarkable role in shaping Indian administration, because the way that things had been decided during those days, ultimately it left some later impact or some future impact as well, and which is still noticed to some extent in Indian administration. That's how you are going to write this answer. Question number 2. 1919 Act is a landmark in Indian freedom struggle and constitutional development in India. Now, this question is talking about 1919 Act. This is one important keyword. Then it comes to Indian freedom struggle. That's the second thing, and the constitutional development in India, right? So basically, you have to write about three things: the 1919 Act and how come it is leaving impact over the over the Indian freedom struggle, and then the constitutional development. So it's again, you have to be, this particular question does have great amount of content. So you have to be very organized while presenting these answers. Mind you, the question number, the compulsory questions, which is question number 4, is always very important. In case of modern India, it is modern India. So you have to be very organized. You have to, you have to convey your ideas in a very lucid manner, because these are the questions which are being checked first. And since these questions or these answers that you have written in the compulsory sections has been it's helping you, or it's deciding the overall marking that you have been getting, and that's why it's very important, and don't take it lightly. And I always suggest this to students, while writing the answers in this part, you have to be very organized, and in fact you have to convey this idea to the evaluator that I do have a very good conceptual understanding, and rest of the things also for this paper. This is the best way of doing it. So if you are leaving a good impression in the compulsory questions, in that case, like it's helping you to score overall better. That's the significance of this. So always keep in mind that. Now this question, so basically a brief introduction about 1919 Act. 1919 Act. So you can just write some of the major decisions which were made in 1919 Act, because if you have conveyed all these ideas and you don't need to elaborate them, you just write the points that these are the important points. You can write a little longer introduction, because that here you need to include some of the important things or the important provisions of this act. And then after this you come to the body part, and in this particular part you have to divide the answer in two parts. Part number 1, where you will be writing that how come it was leaving impact over Indian freedom struggle. So you can write like Indian freedom struggle, right? So here you'll be writing that 1919 Act had been leaving a bigger impact over this Indian freedom struggle. Immediately before it's not 1990, it's 1919, okay? Immediately before this 1919 Act, there was some of very influential movements were there in India. Home Rule League was the most important one, and apart from this also, immediately before 1919 you will find great amount of mobilization among the peasantry, among the labours or the working classes, and that's how the scenario was very different in India. Now Home Rule League movement was also very successful, and since it was very successful and the government was a bit scared of it, because the membership in Home Rule League had reached reached to a kind of very good standard, and that's why the government was a bit afraid of it, and the way Tilak and others have also started supporting this movement, and that's how government was not very happy with this, and they wanted to close this movement. On the other hand, this is the period when Gandhi was also becoming very active in politics, but probably by this time Gandhi was not taken that much seriously that it could really create some severe problem for the government. So that's why the most important threat was the Home Rule League movement. Immediately after this 1919 Act, there are two things happen. The movements which were already on, they were consumed, they were basically absorbed by 1919 Act, because Home Rule League movement was suspended by thinking in this way, that it's going to fulfill all these requirements they had and all these demands they had, and that's how the movement was suspended. On the other hand, after the implementation of 1919 Act, like very soon people had realized that whatever they had been demanding, ultimately it's not got fulfilled or it was not fulfilled, and that's why it worked in two different directions. So initially it helped the government, and then later on it even provoked the people that 1919 Act is ultimately is failing in fulfilling all those promises which were made by the colonial rule. That's the reason because of what we can say that it has really helped the people to be mobilized once again in order to participate in any struggle, and then the result you have seen, the Khilafat and non-cooperation movement. So this is one part of the answer. Then the second part of answer, that's about the constitutional development, right? That is about the constitutional development. Now constitutional development in this way, because here or let's say by 1919 Act, you can find that provincial administration and the provincial government and the central government was now more structured. After this, the only act is coming 1935 Act, and in fact this was nothing but the elaborated version, and there are a couple of changes or the couple of differences, because what mistakes they have done in 1919 Act, they have realized it very soon, and that's how they changed it in 1935 Act, and that's how a basic framework of Indian Constitution was being prepared from three significant acts, that's 1909, 1919 and 1935. So that's how we'll write that what are the important implications it had or important provisions it had, and how come it was helping to reframe this Indian Constitution. And when you see the proper in the independent Constitution of India or the Constitution of independent India, you can find that like there are many things borrowed from here also, and that's how you're going to write about it, right? And then finally it comes to conclusion. So you'll write about a kind of criticism, and you'll write he'll write that in this particular 1919 Act, the things were gradually developing and it had been leaving multiple impacts over it. So in a longer run, 1919 Act is considered to be a very important or landmark event in Indian history. That's how you are going to conclude it. You can also link it with the future development, and you can say that some things in future had been decided by it. Next question. How far do you agree that Nagpur Congress, Nagpur Congress symbolizes the emergence of a centrist leadership within the pluralistic structure of political India? Explain, 10 marks. Now this question is though asking about the Nagpur Congress, but this question is properly asking you or precisely asking you about the emergence of Gandhi as the leader of Indian freedom movement. But here it is asking you that how far do you agree? Like this question is asking you how far do you agree? So that clearly means ki it is not necessary for you to be convinced completely with this idea, and that's how you have to make a very good answer. But at the same time you should also remember the limitation. So it is a 10-mark question. So you can't explain or elaborate the content a lot. So be very focused. Now the question is asking about the Nagpur session. So in the introduction, he'll simply write about the Nagpur session. I'm just avoiding the factual details because you can find it in the model hint. Nagpur session, right? Nagpur session. Now, when did it happen? What are the important decisions made by this particular session? This is what you're going to write. And you'll write that Gandhi emerged here as one of the, now why one of the, I think the most important leader of Indian freedom movement. Then it comes to the body part, and he'll be writing about couple of things. How come the situation of Indian freedom movement was before becoming Gandhi or before getting Gandhi into this central position. So he'll be writing about the various ideologies which were very active, various ideologies in Indian freedom movement, such as moderates were still very active, the extremists are still there, the revolutionaries are also very active, right? At the same time, you can find that some peasantry movement and the others also started coming up. So that's how Indian freedom movement was somehow. And if we'll talk precisely about Congress also, within Congress also you can find that some of the shufflings were there, some new ideologies were there, and in fact this is the period when Indian left was also started making its making its entry into Indian politics. So that's how the various ideologies were there. So first of all, in one paragraph he'll write about various ideologies. You can write it in point format also, and then he'll be writing about the way Gandhi proposed the non-cooperation movement. And initially there was some opposition of Gandhian proposal by C.R. Das, but finally C.R. Das had to surrender, and that's how you are going to write ki yes, this is true, that now at least during the non-cooperation movement Gandhi became the centrist, Gandhi took the centrist leadership. But since it is asking you how far do you agree, and that's how you need to write about some counter arguments also, counter arguments also. And in this counter argument, he'll write that here this is true that as far as this Khilafat and non-cooperation movement is concerned, Gandhiji had been taking definitely the centrist leadership. But it's not true that Gandhiji became so powerful or so influential that the other ideologies were totally down or they could not come up later on. Like, this is not true. Immediately after the end of this particular movement, the non-cooperation movement, you can find that many other ideologies also started coming up. That includes such as the fundamentalist voices, Hindu fundamentalist voices, the Muslim fundamentalist voice. Then you can talk about, let's say, left movement. You can talk about the Swarajist voice. You can talk about the Dalit voice, and etc., etc., etc. So you can say that it was only a temporary phenomena where Gandhiji was leading the Indian freedom movement solely, and in fact it is something which is somehow created, or a kind of it is something which is desperately, or this idea has been created by certain historians, those who had been writing with a pro-Gandhian approach. Practically speaking, Indian freedom movement was still about many ideologies working together, and that's how you'll give a counter perspective as well. But still, like towards the end of the answer, you are going to write about Gandhiji once again. Because look, Gandhiji does have a very significant role in Indian freedom movement, and that's how at any moment you don't need to convey this idea that he was just useless or he was not having any great contribution. Like, no, you can't write in this way. So you still write that even though like all these ideologies were there, still Gandhiji had kept on playing a very important role here. So yeah, very important role here. That's how you're going to write about it, this question. So within this limited number of words, you have to incorporate all these ideas in a brief, right? But the maximum amount of content should be conveyed, or not content, basically ideas should be conveyed. That you should remember here, right? Okay. Next question. How far do you agree that the Muslim mobilization under the banner of Khilafat generated a sense of inferiority and insecurity among Hindus who now started counter mobilization? Okay, now this question is again like very in-depth questions. It's very basically a kind of tricky question. So you have to write here first of all, like so you first identify what are the keywords. So it's Muslim mobilization under the Khilafat and the sense of inferiority among Hindus, and that started the counter mobilization. These are three ideas around which you need to frame the question. ठीक है? अब ये थ्री वर्ड्स के अराउंड आप कैसे क्वेश्चंस फ्रेम करेंगे आप देख लीजिए. सबसे पहले तो ये देखिए कि व्हाट इज दिस खिलाफत मूवमेंट. ठीक है, एंड हियर ओनली, ठीक है, यू हैव टू मेक इट वेरी क्लियर दैट खिलाफत मूवमेंट वाज नॉट मियरली टू like settle down the Turkish issue as such. Whatever was happening in Turkey, that is true. Most of the Muslims are like we can say the majority of the Muslims were really disturbed of this. बट प्रोबेबली इट वॉज नॉट द मेन टारगेट. ऐसा नहीं है कि जो वो लोग बाकी कैलिफ जो है कैलिफ के लिए बहुत कॉन्शियस हैं और उनको बचाना चाहते हैं. टू सम एक्सटेंट इट इज करेक्ट टू से कि या दिस इज हाउ इट वॉज, बट एट द सेकेंड टाइम लाइक एट द सेम टाइम आई मस्ट से that Khilafat was having another objective, and what objective this was? This was simply to establish the Muslim politics in India. So basically they had been emphasizing on Muslim identity. And I think if you have studied any book, any serious book on modern India, in that case you can find in the analysis of the Khilafat, it has been clearly written that Muslim leadership has identified that until and unless very sensitive issue has been raised by them, the Muslims of this country won't be united, because you know about this diversity in India, and probably Indian people were not divided in the line of religion in the same way, the way the leaders were expecting. But Khilafat or the Caliph issue was as such which could have appealed everyone. That's the reason because of what they went for it. So undoubtedly this was one their hidden objective, to target the Muslim mobilization. They even used the popularity of Gandhi for doing so, though that's a different thing that Gandhi had been using this Muslim mobilization for the Indian freedom movement. So you'll write that Khilafat was a movement which was very much, Khilafat was a movement which was very much having this objective of Muslim mobilization, right? Then after this Muslim mobilization, then when it comes to the body part, and you'll write that unfortunately the end of this movement was not pretty well. The end of this movement was not very well, because the end of this movement could be, could The end of the end of this movement was very much noticed with the communal violences, and these communal violences somehow created an insecurity among even the Hindus also, and that's how, in order to counter them, a Hindu mobilization also started. So it's not true that the Hindu mobilization was a new thing. Like 1915, this organization Hindu Mahasabha was formed, but Hindu Mahasabha was very deactive, or it was not very active as such throughout this period. But from 1925 onwards, you can find this. This is the second paragraph, and 1925 will write about the mobilization among the Hindus. The Hindu Mahasabha became very active, and some important leaders were coming, Savarkar, Jaikar, and such people. And they had started giving a direction to this particular movement, and that's how the fundamentalists were gradually becoming strong, not only outside of Congress but even within the Congress. You can also refer the 1926 election, because in 1926 election the Swarajists were marginalized and the Hindu fundamentalists were becoming more dominant. The issues you can discuss, that whatever the issues were very active, at least in North India, specifically in Punjab, UP and all these areas, and that's how we can say ki yes, this is true, that this counter mobilization somehow still, like counter mobilization generated a kind of Hindu fundamentalism. That's also true, right? When it comes to conclusion, like conclusion, you can write about the communalism in India, and you can write ki this, for this communalism, I think not only one community was responsible, but I think it was being done, or it was being promoted by all the communities simultaneously, right? That's how you can end the answer with the communalism, right? Next question. Revolutionary terrorism change its attitude in third decade. Okay, revolutionary terrorism, okay, change its attitude. It's talking about the attitude in the third decade. This is a very simple and the factual question, I must say, in 20th century, third decade of 20th century. Now, revolutionary terrorism. So, we'll start the answer with the history of revolutionary terrorism. Since it is not asking about the revolutionary terrorism in the, in the beginning, on the beginning of, let's say, 20th century or towards the end of 19th century, but yes, there was a revolutionary movement that could be noticed, and this revolutionary movement, more or less with some sort of discontinuity, continued, it's continued, just a second. Okay, so sorry for the interruption. Okay. So yes, it was revolutionary terrorism, like it's changing its attitude. So it's a comparative question. Okay. It's asking you to compare the first phase with the second phase, and that's why you can't ignore writing about this. So you'll write about a brief introduction of the revolutionary movement in India, and this revolutionary movement, I must say, you start with the first phase also. Okay, this or so and so period is the first phase, and then so and so is the second phase of this revolutionary movement. So you just make it very clear that we can study the revolutionary movement in two distinct phases. So you'll write about it, and then you'll write about, in the body part, you'll have to simply write about some key ideas or the changes which could be noticed in the movement in the second half. I think that's a very simple part. The way it's being organized, the way it's being influenced by socialism or the leftist idea, the way you can say that now these are not believing in the sort of individual acts of violence and all. Rather, they had been believing in the idea of revolution against the colonial rule. So these are some major changes that could be noticed. The way they were more particular about Indian nationalism or conscious about Indian nationalism. So these are the changes which had been, which you will be writing here, right? You can refer some examples also. I think it's compulsory. You have to write about some examples, and then it comes to conclusion. Now, in the conclusion, you have to write basically the way this revolutionary movement had a far-reaching or great impact over the over the India. Either you talk about the colonized India or independent India, like they became the kind of role model for everyone. The way we have been remembering Bhagat Singh or let's say Chandrasekhar Azad these days also, the way we talk about a kind of aggressive nationalism, whereas at any point we are very at every point we may be very liberal, but the moment it comes to nationalism we become very aggressive. So these kind of ideas that we learned there, and in fact they are still the role model of India. And that's the significance of this second phase of revolutionary movement. So you have to highlight on this part, and in fact this is the period when you need to sow the nationalism within you, right? Okay. Next question. Do you subscribe the view that Indian socialism was not tuned as per Indian condition? That's a very good question. Now this is asking that Indian socialism was not tuned as per the Indian conditions. I think this question you have to answer it in a very organized manner, right? So I'll just write the introduction and I'll briefly write what exactly this Indian socialism is. And the moment you talk about Indian socialism, I think you should make it very clear that it's not about one sort of ideas. It was basically a mixture of many different ideas I am telling you. So the way there was some liberal, there was some hardcore leftist people or hardcore communist fellows, some liberals were also there, then the socialist idea within Congress is also there, and that's how it's not just one idea, rather it's the mixture of many ideas, or it is being expressed by different groups in different ways, and that's how Indian left or Indian socialism was. So it'll just make this idea very clear in the beginning itself, right? In the beginning itself, and then in the body part you have to divide this answer in two different ways. Okay? First he'll write about the proper left in India, the Communist Party of India, and he'll write about some of the stages and the way they had been making the decisions in different stages. Now this particular left was never tuned as per the Indian requirements. This is true that India had a goal or objective. What was that? That was very simply to get or win the independence for India. But unfortunately this group was not working with this objective, rather this objective was altogether different, and this is just talking about this is just being guided by the international comment. Russian instructions were more important to them, and that's how they could not understand the sentiments, or they could not match their sentiments with the Indian sentiments, and that's the reason because of at any point of time they could not make the right decision. So you can talk about civil disobedience movement, you can talk about 1935 decision, this I am just talking about this Dutt-Bradley thesis. We can also talk about 1942, the Quit India movement. Nowhere they were capable of making the right decisions, and that created overall the problem. But this does not mean, this is one idea. The second idea, this does not mean that every socialist party had been reacting in this way. So we'll be writing about Congress Socialist Party, and it was tuned as per the Indian requirements, right? So that's why you'll say that it is not correct to say that Indian Socialist Party or Indian socialism was never tuned as per the Indian requirement. So in the conclusion, he'll write that there are certain sections which were tuned as per the Indian requirement, and in fact they were very successful also. So the hardcore left was not able to somehow become very dominant in this country or very popular in this country. Certain patches where they remained confined throughout this history, whether the socialist idea in a moderate way was very much influential in India. That's how you're going to write this answer. Okay, next. It was the non-cooperation movement after which Congress formally recognized the importance of peasantry and workers in the anti-imperial movement. Now this question is again, you have to write the answer in a very smart way. Peasantry and workers movement. Okay. Now he'll write the non-cooperation movement, or he'll write, he can write in the introduction, you can start it with the NCM, non-cooperation movement, and he'll just write the active participation of the peasantry and the laborers or workers in non-cooperation movement, right? And then he'll write that what was the initial plan. In the body part he'll write the initial plan, and Gandhiji was trying to mobilize the various Indian sections or the various sections of Indian communities or Indian society. But by that time he realized that actually the Indian proletariat section is basically, or the lower section of Indian society, the rural people, they were not very much habituated of a political movement, and that's how he had been planning this movement with the help of I can say the middle class leaders, not only in tier 1 and tier 2 cities, but even from the other parts, right? This is how he had been planning. But he'll write that unfortunately the participation by the middle class, the middle class participation was not up to the mark. That's the reality. Somehow what expectations Gandhiji or Congress had from them, unfortunately they did not react in this way. Rather it was, I can say, it was very liberal or very, what to say, that kind of negligence could be noticed. But on the other hand, the people, those who never wanted, like Congress never wanted to participate in this movement, they were very active. And in fact, the reason behind this, like we will be writing about the peasant and workers party, right? The way there was great amount of mobilization among them, and that's how their role could not be ignored. And probably this is the reason because of what this movement becomes very successful, because of their participation. And that's why hereafter, whatever the movement had been planned, like it was ultimately based, or it was ultimately planned with or on the or like it was planned on the basis of the participation of peasantry in the worker people, right? Working people. So that's how you need to write about it. You have to explain the things properly here. It's a very conceptual question, and that's the reason you need to explain it properly. Then only you'll be able to convey your ideas properly. So there are some factual examples which are also required that you can find in the model interest also, right? Moving to the next question. Okay, first of all, my apologies there. How far do you agree that what was articulated in the 1932 communal award, okay, 1932 communal award was nothing but a well-prepared design to strengthen the argument that Muslims were a separate community. It's not Muslims, right? It's wrong. It's Dalits, were a separate community with a distinct identity. I think this question is a very simple question. It is all about how do you present it, right? So you'll be writing about what is this communal award, okay? In the introduction, you'll simply write the communal award. If you have some statements of certain people, you can start your answer with them also, ठीक है? कुछ statement हो leaders के, आप शुरू कर सकते हैं उससे answer communal award, right? Then what you are supposed to write further, that actually there was a policy of divide and rule. Like you start with this divide and rule policy. And when it comes to divide and rule policy, we'll start with the Muslim community. Yes, 1919 Act. Okay. Even you can discuss about the things, some facts, even of the previous period. The book written by William Hunter called as Indian Musalman, then Aligarh movement and so on, right? So you can write about all these things, and like briefly, you have to convey this idea that the colonial rule had been working on this idea, and they just wanted to exploit this idea. By 1930s, they had fully exploited this idea, and in fact, whatever the fractions they wanted to create within India, they have done it. But since like even let's say, excluding the Muslims, the Indian freedom movement was very powerful. So now it was necessary for them to fracture it further, and that's how they came up with the Dalit question. And then you can write about this, all the things which were happening, the way the round table conference, the offer, and then the the effort to separate this community from them. So this is what he'll write, and he'll be writing about that the way Gandhiji settled this issue. So Pune Pact also, you can end your answer with the Pune Pact. So it's a simple question. It's all it's all about the presentation and including the right thing to convey your idea in a very lucid manner. That's it. Okay, next question. How far do you agree that India got its freedom because of the subaltern nationalism, not because of the elite nationalism? Now this question is again very tough to be answered, but yes, don't get into that debate. Rather, you just make a balance. So how far, this is asking you to evaluate, and that's why you have to be very tricky here. Now this question is asking that whether India is winning its independence because of elite nationalism or the subaltern nationalism. So first of all, he'll be writing about the introduction, and in the introduction he'll write about the rise of nationalism in India. Rise of nationalism in India. Right? Now this question must be dealt with respect to historiography. In that case, you can play safe here. Why am I asking you to play safe? Because there are different groups of historians, they all do have their arguments. So you'll simply write the rise of nationalism. Don't get into the historiography here, you simply write ki nationalism, second half of 19th century, nationalism is coming up, right? And then you just play with these two ideas. In the body part, there are two different ideas. So initially it is about the elite nationalism, and write it with respect to the historians. Okay? There was a concept of elite nationalism, and according to them, India is achieving its independence through this way, right? Then the counter argument. This is one argument, and the counter argument is about the subaltern nationalism, and the way people like Ranjit Guha and all, like they do talk about the subaltern nationalism, and they believe that actually it is achieved by them. Okay? Because it was not possible only by the elite class leaders to achieve independence. So there are two distinct ideas which had been given. And then it comes to conclusion, and in the conclusion it will be giving the credit to both. Until and unless both of them were coming together, it was impossible for India to achieve its independence. That's how you'll just make the balance here. Because maybe it was more responsible, maybe it is also true that they were more responsible, but ultimately you can't give the credit to anyone, and that's why you have to make a balance within the, in the end of the answer or in the conclusion of the answer. That's how you are going to frame this answer. Okay. Next question. Do you really think that nationalism and reformism seems to be contradictory ideas? Nationalism and reformism seems to be contradictory ideas, in which led to the great growth of anti-reformism based on the sense of pride and everything Indian. Right? That's a very good question again. So it's talking about basically what it's talking about the revivalist movement and a section of leaders which had been talking about a different kind of nationalism. So it's very much linked to that previous question also. So you have to write that nationalism, okay, or you can start this as a question with, in the introduction part, you have to simply write about the reformism in the beginning of 19th century changed into revivalism towards the end of 19th century. So you just write about this transition very simply, right? And then in the body part you try to evaluate. Okay? So first of all you define that what kind of revivalism it was. You just write about revivalism, their ideas, their acts, their ideologies and all. So you'll be writing about Arya Samaj, you'll be writing about Swami Vivekananda, you'll be writing about Tilak and all, and that's how you'll write, right? And then he'll go for this analysis. That how come we can say, you will go for this analysis, that how come we can say that it was the result of nationalism, right? So it was result of the emerging nationalism. So basically in the second half of 19th century, Indian nationalism is coming into existence, and this nationalism could not have allowed the reformists to accept the criticism done by the colonial masters, and according to those criticism they were supposed to save the Indian reform movement, and at the same time for reforming the society they had been taking the help of the colonial rule itself. I think that could not have done. So it had created a kind of basic problem, and that's how they just changed their mentality or their approach towards it. And then there are two segments that could be noticed here. Okay? One segment they were still reformists, okay? And this segment was talking about reform, but not by taking help from the colonial rule, but by getting some progressive ideas, by glorifying the past, and by proving that actually in Indian past all these problems were not there, and that's how these are not really social flaws within Indian society. That's how they had a different approach towards it. On the other hand, some political leaders took it very differently, and this is the period they started talking about this cultural pride of India, and that's how on some occasions they have even started supporting, some wrong ideas, like the way certain cases you can discuss, the way Rukma Bai case you can refer, the Urdu Nagri controversy you can discuss. Like there are several examples. The history is full of such examples towards the end of 19th century where the people had been supporting these kind of ideas, and that's how you'll write about it. Got my point? And then you'll write in the conclusion that yes, this is true, that this kind of ideas to some extent was helping the Indians to come up with a kind of more Indian nationalism, right, or more authentic Indian nationalism, because earlier the nationalism was also considered to be the gift by the colonial people, but somehow this was giving a kind of rise of Indian nationalism or concept of Indian nationalism. That's how you're going to write about this question, right? Okay. Next question. In the process of the freedom struggle, the politicization of women failed to promote any significant extent the social emancipation of women in India. So, politicization of women and the social emancipation of India. To what extent these two ideas are linked, whether they are linked or not, this is what you need to prove. अब आप जिस इस क्वेश्चन की बात करेंगे तो सबसे पहले तो आपको ये प्रूव करना पड़ेगा कि there was a politicization of women, or else you can write intro, right? In the intro, he'll write about the women participation. That's it. This woman participation in Indian freedom movement. ठीक है? ये women participation पे आप बात करेंगे. ठीक है? That's it. Then he'll write about the next part. You know, in the body part, he'll write about the efforts to women reforms. Women reforms. So we'll just write it that what are the efforts so far were there, such as the reformers in the first half of 19th century. Then even the revivalists also talked about, you know, the women reform. Then some legal ads or some legal supports were also there to reform it. So that's how it is going on. But then he'll write that it is impossible until and unless the woman consciousness is there itself. Until and unless the women are they themselves very conscious for the woman reform, it's not possible. Then he'll come to the main idea of this answer, and he'll write that politicization of women is something which were really doing a kind of overall growth or the development of women. Once the women are participating in the freedom movement, and in that case, like of course they were at the same time becoming very conscious. I'm very conscious about their rights. I cannot say that it was a universal phenomena. It can't be. It can't be, because like sometimes we do find that there are some women that are politically very conscious, but when it comes to the women issues, unfortunately they are not able to convey their ideas in that way. So that's how I can say it cannot be presented in this way. But yes, you can write that certain efforts started coming, and then you'll write about certain organizations being set up by them from 1917-18 onwards, right? So he'll write about the women organizations, and the most surprising thing, okay, here that these women organizations were being set up by the women themselves, and they were very conscious about the women reforms, and that's how we can say ki yes, there was a kind of proportional relationship between the women participation or politicization and the social reformation movement. So I think yes, it was moving moving on. Maybe the pace is slow, but it was going on. And then in the conclusion, he'll write about some of the important achievements of the women, and in fact the way they were given the suffrage, and in fact India is one of the earliest countries where the women's suffrage was there. So these are the things which were really very progressive, and in fact India had achieved so many things much before than even European countries also, and you can see that it was the result of this participation. The way we find that an environment where the women had been treated equally, to some extent the result, it was lying on this fact that the women were very much politicized in India, and that's how we are going to conclude this answer. Okay, next question. The political extremism in the second half of 19th century, right? Political extremism in the second half of the 19th century was not just a reaction to moderate failure. It drew the inspiration and ideology from the cultural and intellectual movements. Now, this is something partially I have already discussed. That initially, it can be again dealt with this. I mean to say historiography. So let's say when you write about introduction, you just give a brief introduction of the extremist ideas. Okay. It should be factual, there is no problem. Okay. What exactly this extremism was, you can write about that. Okay. कि आप simply लिख दीजिए कि extremism क्या है, ठीक है? And then he'll go to inquire he'll go to inquire that what were the reasons behind the rise of this extremism. Okay? So there are two reasons. There was one, the failure of moderates. Failure of moderates. So in a very simple way, in certain points, he'll write that the moderates failed, and that has really provoked the extremists. Fair enough. Okay? And then, but it won't be emphasized a lot. And in the second part, he'll write about the same thing, that India was changing even in other manners, or even in other manners as well, specifically towards the last 2 decades of 20th century, 19th century. And the way that sense of cultural pride was there, and the way there was a kind of rift, or there was a kind of conflict between 2 different ideologies prevailing in all the segments of Indian society, that could be noticed here. Newspaper, there was a rivalry between the extremist idea and the liberal idea. If we'll talk about the organizations, some organizations were extremist, some were liberal. So that's how in every segment of Indian society you can find, or in every domain of Indian society you can find that this drift was there. And then this is the period when the revivalists had started talking about that sense of Indian culture, or the pride in Indian culture, and that's how we can say that it was very much different. And that's how extremists, for the rise of extremists, we cannot give this credit only to the failure of moderates, but the other reasons were also responsible for it. So in the conclusion, you can conclude this answer. There is no problem, because this is how it was. We cannot give the degree, but yes, we can talk about it. Next, the new generation of industrialists coming from an expanded social base was more mature and least prepared. It's not list here, it's least prepared to surrender to imperialism. At this stage, what was the political attitude of the Indian business community towards nationalism, right? So, okay, like in the introduction, I'll just write briefly that how come from 1850s, there was a growth of 1850s, there was a growth of industrialization, and here industrialization, and here you would emphasize on Indian industrialists rather than the European capital, which was also giving some sort of, or doing some sort of industrialization of India, right? So basically you can talk about this, industrialization, right? Industrialization of India, and then it comes to the body part, and you'll write about the growth of this industrialization from 1850s, right? 1850s to 1914 or 15. Now there was a very moderate growth. Okay? Somehow they were just fulfilling the requirement of Indian demands. They were not capable of expanding their business. They were working on a minimal profit. Their profit was maximum by exploiting the laborers and working people and all. That's how they were. But 1914 to 1920, there was another period. This is stage number 1. This is 1914 to 19, that period. Now they got the taste of success, because the way about the First World War, some liberal policies, and they tasted the success. And then the next period is coming from 1919 onwards. As in this period, after the end of First World War, the colonial rule, basically the Britain, has now shifted or transformed its policy in order to support their own industrialists, and that's how all those restrictions were put over or imposed over the Indian industries once again. Now they were bit conscious about these things, and that's why they were understanding these things. If they would be having their own government, then only they could become very successful, and that's why from 1920 onwards they started changing their policy. And the way the FICCI is getting formed, they were coming together and they decided to support Congress, because they found it is the Congress which does have the potential to really protect their interest, and that's how this particular attitude could be noticed among them. So this is how I can say this is a gradual journey, and that ultimately results in a way that a nationalist businessman or the nationalist industrialist community could be noticed. And that's the result of this. Though this also could not retain forever, but you can stop the answer here, and you can write in the conclusion that they were always remain guided by their own interest, that's profit, but still they had realized that what is the importance of having their own government, and that's why from this point they always remain with Congress, sometimes fully, sometimes partially. That's a different thing, but that's how the things happen, right? Okay. Next question. The various factors were responsible. The various factors were responsible for making Gandhi as the Gandhi. Okay. So it's asking this question is again a very simple question. It is all about your understanding. Okay. Whether you have understood Gandhi properly or not. Now this question is asking about the Gandhian popularity. So when you write about the introduction, you write about the popularity of Gandhi, or let's say you simply write that the Gandhi was very different from Gandhi. The Gandhi was very popular, is considered to be the leader of Indian freedom movement and so on. A brief and write an influential introduction that can really convey this idea that Gandhi was undoubtedly very important in Indian freedom movement, right? And then you'll be writing about the body part. You'll be writing the factors. Okay. So there are many factors. You can find it in the notes also. But the factors were like the Indian scenario, the First World War, then the atrocities of the First World War, then the weak Indian freedom movement. Then you can talk about, let's say, the Home Rule League movement. You can talk about the charismatic leader of Gandhiship. You can talk about the, the very layman versions or the layman terms being used by Gandhi. You can talk about, you can even take the help of the historians also, because in that way you will be able to present it in a very good way. So you can talk about, you can talk about Sahid Amin. You can talk about the other historians, those who have been talking about. You can find the references in the model hint also. So there are many factors. There are many factors which are somehow helping Mahatma Gandhi to gain popularity, and that's how in a very shorter span of period he gained great amount of popularity. So there are some which are not generated by Gandhi. There are some which were basically done by Gandhiji. He had this talent, he had this beauty, that how to mobilize the people. So all the things which were responsible here, and that's how you're going to write about Gandhi. In the conclusion, it may be a very general conclusion. That's not a problem, because ultimately it is proving that it's not only Gandhi who had the talent because of what he became very, very popular, but the circumstances were also responsible for making Gandhi very popular. Okay, question number 5. Examine how this August Revolution was the most serious rebellion. August Revolution, most serious rebellion since 1857. Okay? That's a very simple question. Okay? You have to write, you have to write the introduction, and you'll be writing that how come August Revolution was a very important one. You just write something about this rebellion, and then in the body part you have to write the features of this movement. Okay? Features of this movement. Now one by one, features in terms of class participation, features in terms of caste participation, the regional participation, then the various sections of the society participation, the intensity, the in the governments, the Tamluk Sarkar and all these things. So you just write with respect to the features, and you prove that this is the period when almost every Indian was mobilized against the colonial rule. So you have to somehow convey this idea by putting some solid arguments in terms of point number 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. And then you prove that yes, like this rebellion was very much responsible for Indian independence. If this won't be there, probably Indian independence would have delayed for some more period of time, because this August Rebellion had really proved that Indians now could not be restricted anymore, and you have to give freedom to Indians. That's the significance of this. So you'll just talk about significance of this movement in the conclusion, and that's how you're going to conclude this answer. Next. The freedom of India was seized by the Indians, or power was transferred voluntarily by the British as an act of positive statesmanship. Give your analytical overview. Now this question is about Indian freedom. So again a very simple question. It's a historiography based question, introduction. So it's simply write about Indian independence or Indian freedom. आप लिख दीजिए कि इंडियन फ्रीडम ऐसे ये हो गया, ठीक है, और इंट्रोडक्शन के बाद इसके बाद बॉडी पार्ट में दीजिए, ठीक है. अब यहाँ पे जो imperialist स्कूल है, दैट imperialist स्कूल इज टॉकिंग अबाउट imperialist और लेट्स से कैम्ब्रिज और लेट्स से न्यू लिबरल, ठीक है. अब कितने सारे ग्रुप्स की बात कर सकते हैं, ठीक है. imperialist, liberal, neo-liberal, they are talking about the British as voluntary by British Act of Positive Statesmanship, ठीक है. So it was ultimately done. It was ultimately done by the Britishers, and they were not willing further to colonize India. So this is their idea. Then it comes to the other ideas. Okay. After imperialist, you can talk about Marxist idea. Okay. Now the Marxist idea is talking about the various kind of economic or the financial crunches which were there. Now it was not a very smart, it won't be a very smart move by them to continue colonization further in India, and that's how they have been moving it. Then it comes to nationalist. Okay. So you should end your answer with the nationalist argument, where you can talk or you can give the credit to the various movements, the participation of Indians into the movement, and in somewhere you can also talk about the role played by Chiang Kai-shek or Roosevelt. Like one point आपको include करना पड़ेगा उसके बारे में भी, and that's how he'll write about this. When it comes to conclusion, I must tell you that you should conclude the answer in this way कि no, India had achieved its independence because of the effort they had been putting for last 60, 70 or 100 years. It's a result of that. You can conclude. You should conclude the answer in this way only, right? Okay, so the last question of this segment. Gandhi, Bose and Ambedkar are three ideological pillars of present day Indian democracy. Very good question. ठीक है, गांधी, बोस एंड अम्बेडकर. ठीक है, तीन लोग हैं जो पिलर्स है इंडियन डेमोक्रेसी के. ठीक है, आपको कुछ नहीं करना, इंडियन डेमोक्रेसी के बारे में लिखिए एंड टॉक अबाउट द सक्सेस ऑफ इंडियन डेमोक्रेसी. इट्स अ वेरी सक्सेसफुल डेमोक्रेसी, ह्यूज द बिगेस्ट डेमोक्रेसी ऑफ इंडिया. ठीक है, आप कुछ भी लिखिए, ग्लोरीफाई करिए. ठीक है, इंट्रोडक्शन में आप लिखिए कि इट्स अबाउट द इंडियन डेमोक्रेसी. Indian democracy, right? That's one thing. Then it comes to the body part, and in this body part you have to write about three different columns: role of Gandhi, the ideas that we learn from Gandhi, the ideas that we learn from Bose itself. Okay, and there are some great contribution, planning and socialism and other things. Okay, and then Ambedkar, basically the political freedom that we have been enjoying, and not we, basically everybody, every individual is capable of enjoying it. So Indian democracy is based on that. So that's how we'll write about a couple of points on all these three important or three great individuals or personalities and their contribution. And then we'll just conclude that I think this is what make Indian democracy beautiful. Reason? Because there are several kind of different ideas are coming together, and Indian constitution got formed, and that is making the Indian constitution very successful, Indian democracy very successful. लिखना है ऐसे. ठीक है, that's all about this paper. So thank you very much for joining it. So we'll be coming up with the next paper. Thank you very much.